everybody. Good morning. I'm Renda Slim, the director of the Program on Conflict Resolution and Track to Dialogue Initiative here at the Middle East Institute. Pleased to welcome you all to today's panel, which will delve into the many overlapping issues surrounding recent elections in Lebanon and Iraq. On May 6th, general elections were held in Lebanon after being postponed since 2013. The elections were surprising in some ways, but not in others. Low voter turnout, especially in Beirut districts, was surprising. There were some winners, there were some losers, and we will be talking about this. But whether this will change the current political equation or not, I think not. And Paul, I think, and Bilal will talk about this in more detail. It's likely that Mr. Hariri will return to the Prime Minister position and Mr. Birri will retain his speakership post. More importantly, we have a record number of women candidates. However, only 6 of them made it to the parliament. And we have 1 candidate on the civil society list who made it also into the parliament. Lebanon experimented this time with a new electoral law, which has some elements of proportionality. And it looks like the experience of all political parties with this law has been so far positive. So one thing going forward is that now proportionality is going to be part of every new election laws in the future, or whether we keep this election law or not. We have 2 excellent panelists who will help us analyze this result and their domestic and regional implication, especially eventually focusing on the future of US military assistance to Lebanon. Last Saturday, we have elections held in Iraq, and the victory of cleric Muqtada Sadr came as a surprise to many observers, including this one, who predicted a victory by the incumbent Haider al-Abadi. As in Beirut, low voter turnout in some districts, but not all of Iraq, especially in Shia majority regions, reflect a rejection of the status quo. Final results have not been released yet, but I thought I will just put out some of the numbers, which looks to have been confirmed so far. We have the Sadr coalition, Sa'irun, has 54 seats. Remember, this is a 329 seat parliament. So we have the Sadr coalition having secured 54. The conquest list, headed by Hadi al-Amiri, affiliated with the PMF, secured 47. The victory list, led by Mr. Al-Abadi, has 42. The state of law list, led by Mr. Maliki, has 25. Al-Hikmah list, led by Sayyid Al-Hakim, right now has 19. It can stand to either win 1 seat or lose 1 seat, depending on how the voter turnout, how the vote counting continues. We have Al-Qarar list, which is headed by Mr. Al-Nujayfi, has 19, although it is debatable. And we have the Wataniya list, headed by Mr. Alawi, that has 21 seats. This is the major, I'm focusing on lists with the largest numbers. There are many other lists with 2 and 4 and 6 seats. I'm not going to mention this. On the Kurdish side, it looks like the Kurdish duopoly of past times have held pretty well, although there are now calls for a recount and an endorsement by the KDP of a manual recount. Again, the numbers that I have so far, pending the recount and confirmation of the final results, is that KDP expected to end up with 27 seats, PUK with 17, Goran 5 to 6, Barham Saleh CDG with 2, New Generation 4 seats, Islamic Union 2, and Islamic Group 2. So what we have now in Iraq is the beginning, and I hear it has been launched in earnest, the beginning of a set of opaque, behind-the-scenes negotiation about who will be the prime minister going forward, what kind of governing coalition will be formed. I would predict that Abadi might still be the favorite to return to the prime ministry, but again, in conversation I've been having with people in Baghdad, it looks like there is an interest in going with somebody else, somebody who is seen as an independent figure. Who is that somebody else? We will see. So we will be discussing the governing coalition scenarios, what this means for the potential of enacting true political economic reforms, future of the KRG-Baghdad relationship, and particularly also geopolitical implication in terms of Iraq relations with Iran, with the Gulf Arab countries, and the US. We are honored to have with us today an expert panel to discuss these issues. Let me quickly do an introduction of each, and then I will open the discussions by first focusing on Lebanon, then we move to Iraq, and then we alternate between the two. The way I'm going to divide this panel, we will have about 70 minutes, of discussions among the panelists. There will be no presentations rather than just answer to question. And then I hope I can leave the last 50 minutes to 45 minutes to question and answer with the audience. So I will start here with my friend here to my left, Dr. Abbas Qadim. He's the president of the Institute for Shia Studies and senior fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. Prior to joining SAIS, Abbas has held senior government affairs position at the Iraqi embassy in Washington. He's the author of what I think is the best book on the 1922 revolution. I always say that. If you haven't read it, you should read it. The author of Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. Also with us, next to Abbas, is Mr. Omar Al-Niddawi. Omar is the Iraq director at the strategic advisory firm Gryphon Partners. He's also a guest lecturer at the State Department Foreign Service Institute and a fellow with the Truman National Security Project. He's a pioneer of internet journalism in Iraq and an advocate for freedom of expression and the author of numerous articles and reports on Iraq. At the other end of the table is my colleague here at MEI, senior fellow and director of the Defense and Security Program, Bilal Saab. Bilal specializes in the Levant and the Persian Gulf. Previously, he was senior fellow and director of the Middle East Peace and Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, where he also created and chaired the Gulf Policy Working Group and led the Middle East Crisis Simulation Series. Next to Bilal is Dr. Bilal Wahab, the Nathan and Esther K. Wagner Fellow at WINEP, where he focuses on governance in the Iraqi Kurdish region and in Iraq as a whole. Bilal has taught at the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani, where he established the Center for Development and Natural Resources, a research program on oil and development. Last but not least, next to me is my colleague and one of my bosses here, MEI Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Program, Paul Salim. Paul, in my opinion, is one of the most astute analysts of Lebanese politics. But also what's unique about Paul when it comes to Lebanese analysts is that not only does he opine about Lebanon, but also he walks the walks when it comes to Lebanon. So Paul has been actively involved in the political life of Lebanon. He has worked on the Boutros Commission. Previously, he worked with a number of civil society groups to push for proportionality in the election law. So the election law we have seen recently is partly the result of this effort that Paul and his colleague in Lebanon, led many years ago. Before coming here, he was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Beirut Center. He was also worked with the Faris Foundation, and also he was one of the founders of what also I think is Lebanon's premier policy think tank, the Lebanese Center for Policy Study. But also, I don't know if you all know this about Paul, he is a musician. And he is a composer of Arabic Brazilian jazz, and his music can be, found on iTunes. So just a plug for the music.
Thank you.
Anyway, so let me start this, and so thank you again all for coming. Now, one last logistical thing is that we are recording this discussion for posting on the MEI website, and so we ask you to silence your mobile devices, but we also encourage you to tweet this event using the hashtag MEI elections. So let's get started with Lebanon, and my first question is, to Paul, is about explain to us what are the results of the election. There has been this narrative here and elsewhere about Hezbollah having won, the elections. So, are there winners? Are there losers? And what are the implications for the government formation going forward?
Thank you, Randa, and thank you all for coming. Let me start by saying how wonderful it is to have a panel about elections in the Arab world. A few decades ago or years ago, that might not really have been a topic. And I think that's no small matter. Lebanon, of course, has had elections for almost 90 years now, but that we also have elections in Iraq, we have elections in Tunisia, is something really to be quite appreciative of, and to see those traditions taking root. And when I look first at the Lebanese elections, the first conclusion I have is that elections were held after a long delay. That's a good thing. People were able to vote, make choices. There was a fairly wide variety of choice, especially with this new election law. That the systems were revived. This power-sharing electoral democracy exercised its electoral institutions pretty well. The elections went off really without a hitch, and certainly without any violence in a country where you have Sunnis and Shias, Christians and Muslims, where just a couple hours down the road there is major, major warfare. So I start with the glass half full in the sense that simply having elections and having them proceed well with a decent election law and having people's preferences be respected is a major achievement for the stability of the country and the longevity of the political system itself. On the election results, I would say there's no major change in how it affects the political system. This remains a power-sharing system built really on a tripod of three pillars, a Sunni pillar, a Christian Maronite pillar, and a Shiite pillar. Those pillars maybe did a bit better, a bit worse in the elections, but the power-sharing arrangements in general will not be affected in any major way by the results of the election. Prime Minister Hariri, as Randa mentioned, will probably be the prime minister. He remains by far the dominant figure in the Sunni community. President Aoun remains president. He didn't do as well as he expected, but he's still dominant. And the Hezbollah-Amal alliance was and remains dominant in the Shiite community and will control parliament and a third of government seats and things of that nature. Also, that the power-sharing arrangement has been one of sharing power before the elections. So there was nothing major that was being contested, unlike elections back in 2005, where it was really split in very tense ways between March 14 coalition and March 8 coalition. March 14 coalition essentially ceased to exist a couple of years ago for a number of reasons. March 8 coalition also is not a united coalition whatsoever. The results in terms of their sort of details and what people have been remarking on is that if you take the bloc of Hezbollah and Amal and their tight allies, which would account for about 40 seats, if you add to those the bloc of the Free Patriotic Movement, which is led by President Aoun, who have 29 seats, that if you add the 40 and the 29, that's 69, that's a majority in parliament. That did not exist in the last parliament. So that is of some significance, but as I said, it doesn't change the power-sharing arrangement, nor is it a two-thirds majority which you would need to elect a president or to change the constitution or to do anything major. It's also an alliance, it's also a number that is very dependent on politics. In terms of looking at the results as well, the major shift really is the decline of Prime Minister Hariri's bloc from around 33 to around 20. He was liable to lose 8 right off the bat because of the change in the electoral law, but he even did more poorly than expected. He lost another 5, partly because much of the Sunni street is not terribly happy with his leadership or his alignment with Hezbollah. He doesn't have strong backing from Saudi Arabia, so he really didn't do that well. In the Christian community, the surprise was the Lebanese forces did much better than expected, went from 8 seats to 13 seats, which indicates that the Christian community is moving a little bit in an anti-Aoun, anti-Hezbollah, only mildly, but something to keep an eye on. So in the short term, you could say the Hezbollah-Amal alliance scored a kind of a victory, but there are also concerns for them in the longer term that in the Christian community, as President Aoun is aging, they have to figure, given the shift in Christian public opinion, that when he passes away, they're going to have a major problem because Gibran Bassil, his heir, doesn't have his power, and they will have to scramble for alliances in the Christian community. And in the Sunni community, the main person who was cooperating with them, Saad al-Hariri, didn't do too well. So that's a bad signal for them. And in the Druze community, Walid Jumblat did very, very well, and he is not very much on good terms with the Assad regime and not terribly on good terms with them. So no, I wouldn't say any major change. On formation of government, I think that's the battle that's begun now. Everybody's trying to pull the sheets in their direction. Hariri, I think, has come under some pressure, maybe from the West and Saudi Arabia, to fire one of his advisors who was quite close to the Aounist movement and so on. So we'll keep an eye on that. Hariri might be feeling that he needs to pivot a bit away from his Aounist Hezbollah positioning, particularly in the negotiation to form a new government. Obviously, Hezbollah and Amal also are pulling in their direction to get as many ministers in government as they can. So the fight will be over seats in government, portfolios in government, and the content of the ministerial statement. What will it say about the National Army? What will it say about Hezbollah? What will it say about international relations? So that's where we are today, but I will end by saying it was a positive development with some political consequences.
Bilal Saab. So again, there was this, building on what Paul has said in terms of what the Shiite coalition, the Amal Hezbollah coalition did. So there was this narrative of growing dissent within the Shiite community, and I see the election as being dealing this kind of narrative, quite a mortal blow. But the question is, there is this, the community has lost a lot in Syria in terms of young men. The community is not doing well financially. The sanctions have been hurting Hezbollah's ability to deliver on the social services front. So how do you interpret this loyalty, if we can put it, that has been shown to the Hezbollah Amal coalition because they have secured 26 of the 27 seats in the parliament that are reserved for the Shia?
Thank you, Renda, and I think that's an excellent question. So I'll start with that number that you just mentioned, which is 26 out of that 27. It's almost a slam dunk, basically. I don't think they really could have done any better, obviously with the exception of the candidate that they fielded in Jbeil, who was supposed to be accepted by the FPM, but Gibran Bassil had different ideas about that. This kind of electoral performance is really not that surprising, and it's not really that inconsistent with past performances of the organization. They worked very, very hard. They campaigned. They did a number of rallies to which they deployed almost the entire leadership of the organization. The Secretary General of the organization himself was quite active, delivering multiple speeches on various issues. About not just the resistance, but also issues that deal with corruption, that deal with the debt in the Lebanese state. And I'm not sure really those were issues that he addressed, at least in length and in detail, in the past. They ran with a very detailed program that touched on pretty much almost all issues of state administration. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that since 1992, when they decided to enter into parliamentary elections. So they worked very hard, which is why they breathed a very strong sigh of relief when they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. That said, and mind you, as Paul mentioned, other Lebanese parties had some uninspiring performances, which led them to conduct some kind of a review of what the hell happened. And that includes the Future Movement and Saad Hariri himself, to a lesser extent, Kataib. Obviously, they're much smaller. That kind of review never happened in Hezbollah, obviously. I don't think there's any reason to conduct such a review, except that in my mind, and this is where I get into your question, there are beneath these, this very strong showing electorally, there are some challenges, both political and socioeconomic, that I suspect the organization is going to be compelled to face down the road. When you have such a strong showing, it almost masks these other challenges that are quite real, in my opinion, and that they certainly have to face down the road. And the socioeconomic challenges have to do with the organization's decreasing ability to provide for the majority of its constituency. And I specifically refer to two regions outside the south, and those are Baalbek, Hermel, obviously, and Beqa. Okay, well, then you will tell me what they still voted for them. How the hell does that matter? I mean, at the end of the day, there's not much accountability here, and they still very much strongly support the organization. Why does it matter that they are now in a weaker position to provide these social goods that they expect from the organization? It matters because, first of all, I never expect them to punish Hezbollah at the polls, as very much the elections showed. But the type of readjustment in the relationship, the type of frustration that you described, Brenda, the type of doubt about the relationship comes in other forms that in my mind are still significant. It has less to do with elections, but more about the sacrifices that the Shia community has offered Hezbollah for a very long time, and now they might have second opinions about them, and that includes, you might get my vote, but you certainly are not going to get my son to go fight and die in Syria, and specifically in regions like the Beqa Valley, right? So it's really less about the elections, because I don't think this is a time really for the Shia community to try to find a replacement for Hezbollah. There is no credible alternative for this duo of Amal and Hezbollah, to the chagrin of many friends of mine who are Shiites, obviously. But that's the reality, and to dispute that, frankly, would be quite ridiculous. With that, with those types of sacrifices that I see now are in greater question by the community, this poses a huge challenge for the organization. And there's also some kind of a generational change in Lebanon, not just within the Shia community, but also across the country, where many people were not even born during the conflict, long conflict phases with Israel. So therefore, this resistance narrative might not resonate as much within those people who never lived through war, didn't even see the liberation of southern Lebanon in 2000. And so, of course, that changes everything if there's a war tomorrow. I hear you. But it's certainly a factor that Hezbollah is very much concerned about down the road. I'm not saying it's next week, I'm not saying it's next year, but it's certainly something, this generational change, that they have to keep in mind as they pursue their interests in the country. The political challenges are very much consistent with what Paul just mentioned. Those understandings that they formed with the FPM and the future movement of Saad Hariri, so 2006 with the FPM and with Saad Hariri over the past couple of years, right? Those have now become weaker because of what the Christian street, the majority of it at least, and the Sunni street has told us during the elections. In the sense that, fair enough, Saad Hariri is still going to be prime minister, okay? And he probably has now still the biggest Sunni bloc in the parliament, which is 20 deputies, I think. Nevertheless, those who voted against him shows you that that Sunni street is, at least parts of it, are not very much happy with the accommodation of Hezbollah's policies that the prime minister himself has approved of before. And the same thing goes with the FPM. The FPM can no longer claim that they speak for the majority of Christians in Lebanon. And I'm not just looking at the very strong showing of the Lebanese forces, who now have 15 deputies. It's just because of the weakening of that base and the, I don't want to call it disintegration, but the greater pluralistic nature of the Christian community. Therefore, moving forward, Hezbollah is going to be worried about having two understandings with major figures in the next government. So that's Michel Aoun and Saad Hariri, whose own support bases might have difficulties with the policies that they pursue moving forward.
Thank you, Bilal. It's a great segue to my next question to Paul, which is, how is Aoun going to position himself going forward? You know, he has now, 4.5 years left in his term. So there is a legacy, if he thinks in these terms. But there is also his son-in-law, Jubran Bassil, who has major presidential ambitions. So between the two of them, how do you see Aoun, how do you see the FPM, building on what Bilal has just said, going forward? Recently, Aoun has called or has, signaled that he would like to reconvene the national dialogue to discuss Lebanon's national defense strategy. So how do you see this evolving? What are the prospects now? Please.
Well, I would say that Michel Aoun ran for president from the right and is governing from the center, which is kind of a familiar thing in maybe U.S. politics. He figured he couldn't get to the presidency. He had to either go with March 14 or March 8. March 14 didn't accept him. He went to March 8, and now he's president. As president, he's governing from the center, has been, and wants to continue, because his presidency cannot succeed unless he also has, he and his government and the state has excellent relations with the Gulf countries, with Europe and the United States. He cannot go against Hezbollah or Iran or something because they have the power to eliminate him or others and so on. But also, and this is a bit like where Prime Minister Abadi in Iraq, that in order to have economic growth and development and jobs, you need the Gulf countries and you need Europe and you need the United States. So that's where President Aoun was already and where he wants to go. It's also maybe not terribly well known that the FPM has effectively been in alliance with the Future movement since Prime Minister Hariri has been in government, and that the real governing alliance is between the Free Patriotic Movement and the Future movement in government, fighting against Nabih Berri, who's part of the March 8 coalition. That is likely to continue. The challenges that President Aoun and Prime Minister Hariri face, part of it relates to, of course, the domestic scene that we talked about, but also the regional and international scene, which fluctuates a bit from periods of understanding that, okay, we get it, you have to coexist with Hezbollah, so we won't punish you for it, to periods of, no, you have to stand up to them and you have to be tough. I think right now, after the elections, we're going through another slightly tough period because there's a struggle over the formation of the government and the government statement. So Hariri is pulling back, and maybe Gibran Bassil and Michel Aoun have to pull back a bit, moving towards the formation of the government and the government statement. Part of that might be President Aoun promising to start a national dialogue over the arms of Hezbollah. Again, similar situation to what an Iraqi government and the popular mobilization units. How do you deal with that group? Do you call it independent? Do you call it part of the government? So President Aoun might do that. And Aoun has to continue to have one foot in these two camps. Now, Aoun is, he's an older man and not at the best of health. He's trying to set up Gibran Bassil to be the next president. But with the election results that just came out, Gibran Bassil doesn't have a secure way to the presidency unless Saad al-Hariri chooses him to be president. So there's trouble afoot in the presidential race, which is really a main issue about this parliamentary election, and it's going to be a bumpy road between now and then, I think.
Thank you, Bilal. So, where do you see the U.S. military assistance to Lebanon going forward? Do you see potential for this narrative that is, being marketed strongly by some think tanks to gain tractions in Congress and to start putting this assistance, at least on that front, into question?
Thank you, Randa. In the Trump era of instant wins and dramatic optics, U.S. policy towards Lebanon is going to be a hard sell. Okay, not that it was easy before, but it's especially more difficult today. And you mentioned some very influential voices arguing for either cutting, decreasing, or conditioning U.S. aid to Lebanon for a number of reasons, primarily because they feel that that investment is really not paid off because Hezbollah still has its weapons, it still dominates politics in Beirut, and it has infiltrated the Lebanese army, it controls the decisions of its commanders, all of the above, basically. It's a laundry list. So, okay, I'm in the minority, I think, and I find this argument really not that convincing, quite frankly. I think it really is quite useful to, when you talk about U.S. policy towards Lebanon, it's quite useful to compare it to U.S. policies towards other parts of the region and see how those are faring and how those sums of money are going and they're actually contributing to some useful things or not. The way I see it, over the past decade, I think our investment in Lebanon has generated the most dividends, quite frankly. And we have to understand what the United States is trying to do in Lebanon, what they're really up against. What they're trying to do is quite simple, although certainly difficult to pursue, which is to build up the Lebanese state. That's the only thing the United States can do in Lebanon. In a way that certainly does not lead to conflict, a return to civil war. And then the other pillar is to try to apply as much pressure on Hezbollah. Sometimes the two go hand in hand, obviously. Not many successes with regard to building up the economy. I think Lebanon still has the highest debt in the world, obviously. There's a ton to do still in terms of economic reforms, not to mention the corruption and all that stuff. So, that record is not really that promising as far as U.S. assistance. And I think it's been $1.2 billion since 2006 towards that end. Where you see much more progress, obviously, is exactly in the sector that you mentioned, which is the security sector, and specifically to the Lebanese army and to the internal security forces. Compare where the army was in 2007 and where it is today. I mean, it's night and day. If you don't see that evolution, you're certainly missing something. Why does this matter? Because, a strong army in many ways not only defends Lebanon from various threats, including ISIS. I don't need to remind you what happened along the borders just a few months ago and how it was able to evict scores of ISIS fighters from Lebanon back into Syria. But just more broadly, the narrative of having a sole legitimate defender of Lebanon, and I'm not saying that they're going to be able to win a conventional fight with Israel, obviously, but with regard to the various other threats that they face, this is the sole legitimate defender of Lebanon that very much challenges the narrative of Hezbollah being the only one that can actually protect the Lebanese. So that matters. It is a project that requires a lot of patience. In this day and age, you get very little of that, obviously. You need instant wins. It's not sexy. It's a long-term process, but if you want to start measuring the progress, it is there. And I'm not the one to tell you that there's a lot of praise for what the Lebanese army has done within CENTCOM leadership, within top officials in the Defense Department, certainly shared by many colleagues in the State Department. It's just that there are some voices, obviously, in the White House and in other think tanks that you mentioned, Randa, that are just not buying it. And I've been trying to challenge that perception as much as I could. I think that investment has paid off. But those successes, if you want to call them, certainly are fragile, and they could be easily reversed the moment the United States cuts, conditions aid to make it dependent on the Lebanese government more aggressively countering Hezbollah, which I don't think they're in any position to do. And I don't think the United States should be asking the Lebanese people to do that, because certainly that is a path toward a return to arms and perhaps even civil war.
Thank you. We will be hopefully returning back to Lebanon, but now I would like to shift our attention to the Iraqi elections. And then here I would like to start with a question to my colleague Abbas Qadim. So help us do for Iraq, what Paul did for the Lebanese outcomes. I know the final election results are not out yet, but as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, we have pretty much the outline of how things are stacking up. So help us understand what happened, with the Sadr victory. And then maybe also I've seen some of your tweets, smart tweets about, you always do smart tweets, so. but these were particularly smart, explaining the low voter turnout, why, what happened. So,
well, thank you very much, Randa, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very hard for anyone to do what Paul does, but I will do my best. He's not my boss, so I can't say whatever I need to do without being second-guessed. Anyway, let me start first from probably say what I want to say, and then if there is time, I will answer your question.
No. You have to answer my question. That's the deal.
I will. No, it is with that.
Yeah.
A lot has been said, actually, to fit into your question about the Iraqi elections. Most of it, people focus on the negative aspects of it, whether it's the structural parts, such as the election law, the way they allocate the seats, so many other things that have to do with the Iraqi process. Myself included, I write a lot about that. But I will focus on a few positive issues, since Paul started by saying it's great to have an event talking about elections in the Middle East, and Iraq is one of those countries that we are all interested in highlighting that. First, I mean, this is the third timely elections Iraq had since the constitution was ratified. They always held them on time and held them despite all of the challenges that Iraq had, security and otherwise. They held them pretty much to the standards of what the world expects of good, free, and fair elections, and that's the case. The other part also that it is an important aspect of it that no one knew who the winner would be ahead of the elections as it happens in that part of the world. In fact, no one even still knows who the winner will be, because we still, even though the elections are out and the results are out, we still don't know what the outcome will be, because there will be a long negotiation. That's important. The other important aspect of it is that there are few new things. For the first time in Iraq, we see the sitting prime minister actually giving a concession speech and calls the winner and congratulates him. I mean, that's a very good moment to see, and a statesman like act on behalf of Dr. Abadi. Speaking of Dr. Abadi also, I mean, it's an election where the sitting prime minister doesn't win big time or small time. In Baghdad, he came fifth. But even with that, he made history by being the first Shia prime minister to carry a Sunni province, and not just any Sunni province, the largest Sunni province, second largest city or province in Iraq. He carried Mosul, and he carried also seats in Anbar. I mean, that is very good reason to give hope that Iraqis are right now reaching across the sectarian divide and giving trust in each other, and that's great, and that's important. So these are issues that we need to highlight, but also when it comes to the low voter turnout is another new thing. The last turnouts that we've seen were in the 70s and 60s, low 60s, the worst in all times. Now, despite better security conditions, we had less. So what I think about the low voter turnout, it has to do with a few things. One of them, of course, is that people did not have anyone to reward or punish. In the past, everybody was in government, and the same people who participated in the government, they simply reconfigured their alliances and entered for the elections again, and they were seen as having a shot to being in the government again. Now, the results will probably prove otherwise, but that was not known before the elections. That's one important thing. The other important aspect was the fact that even though the government scored great points on security and defeating ISIS, which is an important victory, but they also did not succeed in checking very important boxes that the voters normally think about most anywhere, not just in Iraq, when they go to the election stations. That's the economy, that's the financial issues, that's the social issues, also governance, anti-corruption, all of these issues where the government put on the back burner or aside, focusing completely on the momentous task of defeating ISIS. It's a rationale, but on the other hand, the voter would like to see electricity all night, the night before the elections. That will help them, go out with good night of sleep and being sort of grateful for the prime minister. So he was that. Also, we have to remember that the single issue that would have helped the prime minister defeating ISIS, it was not his credit alone. There were people who shared it. In fact, they did the actual heavy lifting and fighting. So those who rewarded the victory over ISIS, they gave it to the group that ran in the name of the fighters, that is the PMF's, the Fatah coalition. The big surprise that would be when it comes to the results, and maybe we'll talk about the results later, is the fact that Sadr was the victor. And a lot of, you would have thought that the PMUs would have won because of their role in saving Iraq in the beginning and also continuing to help defeat ISIS. And the fact that they were very popular in the Iraqi streets, or the prime minister, the incumbency factor, the fact that he is a very decent Iraqi statesman and he's done a lot, and he did not do damage as the previous administrations. But for Sadr to win, Sadr took a great risk and it worked. Thanks to the solid loyalty of his followers, so he did not lose votes by allying himself with the communists and an assortment of other liberals and others, and also some Sunnis who have had record that was not very popular in Shia populations. But Sadr's voters basically would vote for him no matter what, trust him 100% and throw their loyalty behind him. And he gained on top of what he got from his special quota in Iraq as a Sadrist. He got the extra seats from the allies who came to him bringing their own people and their own voters. And that's the reason. So a lot of people here in town especially were reading Sadr's win as a Shia win. In fact, it's a coalition that the Sadrists didn't win more than their quota, but it is the one alliance that has Shia. It has also liberals and communists, and also has Sunnis in it, and it is probably what Allah tried to do and didn't succeed in the past.
Thank you, Abbas. Omar, so if these numbers stand, and it looks like we are pretty there in terms of where we are going to end up in terms of the allocation of the seats, how do you see the government formation proceeds? What are the scenarios you think that we are contemplating? I know that you have also written a piece in the past about Sadr in foreign affairs.
Multiple ones, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean the one that I know. And so if you can also comment a little bit, building on what Abbas said in terms of why Sadr won what he won, and then but also mostly focus on this government formation process, different election scenarios.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hi, everyone. So yes, I think it is important to remember that when declaring winners and losers in elections in Iraq, that the voting, the results of the vote are not necessarily going to determine who is going to win and who is going to lose. We have seen more than once in Iraq that the party or the person that wins the most votes end up outside of government. It happened with Ayad Allawi in 2010. It happened with Maliki in 2014. So, while the results are important of the vote, they are only a guidance. They provide a first step into the often lengthy and boring horse trading that will happen next to decide the shape of the next government. Now, of course, the fact that we have a clear leader of the pack, so to speak, in Muqtada Sadr's Zairun coalition, that helps. And I think his taking the initiative to announce that who he wants to work with through that interesting tweet that he sent out yesterday.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he was basically naming indirectly naming the parties or coalitions that he wants to work with in this tweet, where he said something along the lines that we move with wisdom towards building a united Iraq, building on the victory, using all the names of the coalitions that he wants to include in the talks, excepting with the exclusion of two prominent parties, and those are Noor al-Maliki's State of Law coalition and the Fatah or Conquest coalition of that is led by the PMF and Hadi al-Amri. So that's I think sending that's an alpha move, kind of sending the signal that he's going to be the man in charge, and he's trying to put the next ruling coalition. And I think he has seen some good responses so far. People have followed his lead. He had received phone calls from Prime Minister Haider Abadi. He has received phone calls from Ammar al-Hakim, the leader of the Wisdom Coalition, and more importantly, I think he had also received a call from Masoud Barzani, the leader of the KDP. All three were, featured prominently in that tweet. So I think that is probably going to be the scenario that's going to play out first. Now, it could succeed or it could not. We could see the nucleus of the next government taking shape around a core comprising Sa'irun, Sadr, Haider al-Abadi's Nasr coalition, and Ammar al-Hakim's Hikma coalition, with the KDP, Kurdistan Democratic Party, probably Wataniya of al-Alawi also coming in, and elements of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, of the PUK, Goran, and others, which would give that coalition, I think, the sufficient edge, the sufficient majority to form and get a cabinet through a vote of confidence in Parliament. Now, it's not to say that this is a clear and easy path. There will be resistance. There is certainly there's going to be pushback from the other side, from the Fatah coalition, from Nour al-Maliki, who will desire to translate their results, their good number of seats that they want, into a big share of the government or into a ruling coalition. They will probably be aided by some political support from outside, from Iran, which will probably try to put obstacles in the path of a coalition that is rather decidedly not very friendly towards Iran, to put that mildly. Now, how that's going to play out depends on the talks that are going to happen in the next few weeks. One could say that Sadr's ability to make that coalition happen, that core coalesce and solidify, is his approach towards the other parties. One of his primary messages, I think, in declaring his policy for the government formation is that he's going to want a non-partisan government, a government in which there are technocrats rather than party affiliates. Now, this is great on paper. It's a great thing for Iraq if it happens, because it allows Parliament to actually function as an effective oversight entity. But at the same time, it kind of gives the other parties that are thinking about joining your coalition a second thought, because what's in it for them? They might go for the higher, for the one that pays the best price. And that could give momentum to the other party. Meaning Amri and Maliki. Yeah. A second force of attraction that could help Amri and Maliki is also the question of the cohesion of the Dawa party. Mm-hmm. The Dawa party has suffered, I think, a lot during this electoral cycle. The party could not run united in the election, so Abadi ran a separate list and Maliki ran a separate list. Neither was under the banner of the Dawa party. I think if Abadi walks out and forms a government with Sadr and the others, that would probably spell a lot of turbulence, almost the end of the Dawa party, a party that is one of the most known, one of the most organized and cohesive parties in Iraq's modern history. So that's going to be a big if that will decide the outcome. I think there's also a third possibility, and that's I think a lot of the cynical views about Iraq's politics point in that direction. Not that this is a bad thing. It's just that is more in line with how business is done, and that is a government of everyone, which we have seen in Iraq in the past, where you can't agree on this centrist pro-reform coalition. You can't put it together. There are too many obstacles. At the same time, you can't put this decidedly pro-Iran coalition, so you end up pretty much bringing everyone and splitting the spoils in the next cabinet. So I think these are primarily the three coalitions that we could see going forward.
So I just want to add that also we might be seeing a split of the conquest list. So I can see Amiri, for example, splitting from his colleagues on that list and joining that cabinet.
That's a very important observation. We have seen in the past that there is a lot of jumping around that happens after the results are announced. people, sometimes individuals or as groups, will move from one list to another, trying to position themselves in the where they see more potential for having a bigger role in the next government.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar. Thank you. Bilal, so the region that looks to us from here the most turbulent and the most divided right now is the Kurdish region. It's the Kurdish political scene also. So how do you see this evolving? On one hand, you have the old Kurdish duopoly doing well.
Right.
I mean, assuming that the elections are not going to be out because of all these allegations of fraudulence, and I know that you have tweeted that the KDP has endorsed now a manual recount of the results, which indirectly says they are comfortable with the results. No matter what, they know they are going to be okay. So how do you see this play out? Why did the opposition parties not do well? What kind of message then are the KRG residents, sending? I mean, is the anticipation of these negotiations that are going to be tough between Erbil and Baghdad going forward after the government is formed, is this something that they had in mind in order to send a strong message of a united front, to Baghdad? So please help us tease this out.
Thank you very much. And I was wondering why I'm being separated from my Iraqi friends. Now I know. You're worried about the turbulent being contagious.
But at the same time, I did not want to put the Iraqis by themselves and the Lebanese by themselves. We are all brothers and sisters.
But I'm dividing two
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, Kurdistan that until recently has been the most stable, both politically and security-wise, part of Iraq, and also probably the most democratic, is going through a series of events that translate into a backlash in the Kurdish progress. The context of this is, of course, the independence referendum that culminated about a quarter of a century of Kurdish self-governance and autonomy. In September of last year, the KRG pushed for independence referendum in the KRG as well as in Kirkuk. That did not go down well, not only with Baghdad, but also with the regional powers and the United States. In fact, the whole world was against it except for maybe two countries. So that resulted in the Iraqi government sending troops back into the areas that were under Kurdish control, and that resulted in a political, military, and economic backlash for Kurdistan, losing half of the territory it controlled in 2014, as well as half of the oil exporting capacity. So the way forward for the Kurds was, catch a breath and start over. And so this election is the start over for Kurdish politics, reintegrating with the Iraqi politics, reinvesting in Iraqi institutions, in Baghdad politics, and also reintegrating the economy, which has been the Achilles heel of the Kurdistan regional government of the KRG. For example, a couple of months ago, 2 months ago, there were protests, boycotts, strikes in many of the KRG civil servant offices because the government wasn't able to dispense public salaries on time. But Kurdish power and influence in Baghdad, in Iraq generally, has also been decreasing since the high time of 2005. Iraqi Kurds were described as kingmakers of Iraq because whichever side they took, that side would become would govern Iraq and would form the government. That was because the Kurdish parties were better organized. Obviously, this was also matched with more chaos on the Iraqi side. In January 2005 and December 2005, the first two elections that Iraq had, the Kurds had a high number of seats. So, for example, in 2005, the Kurds had 77 seats of the 275 Iraqi parliament seats. That's about 28% of seats in the Iraqi parliament. In the last two elections, it's been 17 and 19. So the number of seats have been dwindling. And with that also, Baghdad politics has also taken shape. The fragmentation within the Shia and the Kurdish house created for more possibilities and opportunities for alliances that therefore diminished the sort of influence of the Kurds as tipping the balance in one side's favor against the other. So this resulted in the Kurds simply being at the table as a component in this sort of broad-based, we say حكومة توافقية, inclusive governance or conciliatory government, where everyone is part. So the Kurds have always, been in Baghdad, but of course with their influence waning on one hand, with the security and relationships with Baghdad over oil, over the budget, over the constitution, over Kirkuk deteriorating, obviously the Kurds started eyeing the exit door, investing more in the infrastructure for independence, for the referendum, and that therefore resulted in disengaging from Baghdad. So in a way, the Kurdish influence in Iraq has been dwindling, and therefore the Kurds are kingmakers no more. With this election, factionalism within the Kurdish house, similar to the Sunni house and the Shia house, was the same. In the past, the Kurds would come together, create a big Kurdish list because this is about us versus them. That was not the case this time. The parties ran separately, and the opposition also ran separately. But as Randa mentioned, the ruling Kurdish parties, the KDP and the PUK, did well. Now, in Sulaymaniyah in particular, there are serious accusations of fraud. 6 political parties outside the KDP and the PUK have accused massive industrial-scale election fraud in Sulaymaniyah. Some fingers are pointed toward Iran for helping the PUK as a reward for the role in the recapture of Kirkuk by the Iraqi troops. And they're basically threatening to boycott the political process, the Iraqi politics, unless there is either a recount or fresh elections. What this means moving forward is, how would the Kurds translate this into the next government? Because while Iraqi politics has moved away from elections are over, let's talk about government formation, in Kurdistan the conversation is still about who won and who lost, and so it's still election mode. And if they don't put the house in order, if they don't get their act together, they may actually lose more seats and more influence in Baghdad. Whether we like it or not, it's about seats and positions and how you play with those seats and positions for influence. So the conversation about seat allocations in Baghdad has already started. The Kurds are not part of the conversation yet, and if they don't act quickly and in an organized fashion, then they might actually lose the possibility of even appointing a president. Because the Kurdish president, the president of Iraq, is the first position that gets selected in the parliament. And therefore he will be the president that asks the largest bloc in parliament to form a government. If the Kurds don't put their act together, maybe Iraqi politics will not be interested in waiting for them. And there is interest in the Sunni bloc of actually having a Sunni Arab president, not just the Speaker of Parliament. So the Kurds have also considered the possibility of switching these two positions. The premiership goes to a Shiite politician. Again, these are not rules like Lebanon. This is just a political norm that has emerged in 2005. But there were a conversation within the Kurdish political discourse about which one is more beneficial, Speaker of Parliament or the presidency. But my worry is that the Kurds might actually lose both. Finally, the Kurds have not really given up entirely on the question of independence. However, I think for the time being, they also don't want to be completely weakened and succumb to Baghdad. So while they're participating in the elections, while they're having nominees for these key positions in Baghdad, they're also investing in reinvigorating the oil and gas industry. Rosneft coming into the KRG energy industry, I think, was a major addition to the companies and countries that have invested in the KRG, and the fact that this time it's Russia also sends a signal to the traditional allies of the KRG, the Western allies of the KRG, that we have to basically take care of ourselves with or without you. And a final point maybe here is that some who support democracy in Kurdistan, the Democrats in Kurdistan, are actually also disappointed with the United States because they see that the United States is more interested and involved in promoting democracy in Baghdad than it is in Erbil. The election fraud allegation hasn't really gotten much attention in this town. The attack on opposition headquarters hasn't received much attention in this town. And again, since the referendum, the Kurdish stature that the KRG used to enjoy has also been diminished. So that's also an area that the Kurdish government needs to reinvest in, to basically rebuild that image that recent events has caused them so dearly.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you. I will do one more round of questions to our Iraqi colleagues, and then I'm going to open it for question and answer, if that's okay with everybody. So, Abbas, so the marja'iyya hovers over everybody. The speech, the last speech given by the representative of Sayyid Sistani was very interesting in terms of you go vote, but at the same time, you know, this current slate is not that great, and المجرب كيف؟
المجرب لا يجرب.
المجرب لا يجرب. So how do you see the marja'iyya, you know, playing it going forward? You know, building on what Omar said in terms of different possible election scenario. Is there a scenario they would prefer, and how do you see their play going forward?
Well, the marja'iyya is a very important institution in Iraqi society and in Iraqi power structure, political and social and otherwise. And even though we are at this historic moment having a marja who is not interested in micromanagement of Iraqi politics, and that's a very positive thing, and he has been that way since 2003. Sayyid Sistani has practiced self-restraint, and he only interfered when it was last resort, and all his interferences have been pretty much yielding positive results. That said, the problem is that even if he wants to distance himself from the political process, he cannot, because people keep pushing, asking for the marja'iyya opinion, and also the political class has been abusing the silence of the marja'iyya by hinting that, or speaking on its behalf, claiming that they have support, etc. So sometimes they are forced to speak just to sort of make certain points clear to the people. It was interesting, as you mentioned, the speech before Friday came to settle a dispute between two parties. One party that was pushing for mass participation in elections, and there was another sort of movement that asked for boycott, including some prominent clerics. And then people were waiting and asking the marja'iyya to tell them what they should do on both, tell them whether or not to vote, and tell them even, ironically, whom to vote for. So what Sistani came out through his representative and in fact took a constitutional line. He told people, look, the law says that it is your right to vote, as it is your right not to vote. So that's the legal framework for voting. No one can force you to do either way. And that kind of was interpreted by both sides, that, you know, especially the boycotting people said, well, see, Sistani does not object to the fact that you should go and boycott. But on the other hand, he also encouraged people to go and vote. He encouraged people to vote as smart and responsible voters. He said, you vet everything in life, so should you do with the candidates. You have to check those candidates, see what their background was, what their past performance was, and then choose after you only investigate each and every individual and select those that you think will help you out. But also in the Friday sermon that was announced on behalf of Sayyid Sistani was another aspect. He did criticize harshly the election law. And that would have been a major flaw, actually, in the sermon if they didn't mention that. The Iraqi election law is probably the major shortcoming in all of the process, because it is a law that is unfair, that is written by and for the ruling class, and it does not give the electorate much choice in that. Remember also, Iraqis don't elect a prime minister or even elect a president or a cabinet. They elect negotiators. That's why we still are talking about scenarios, as Omar and Bilal mentioned. What is going to happen, and nobody knows, because you have they elect the parliamentarians, and then those people who are elected will go with a mandate they claim for themselves to go and negotiate a settlement that could go either way, negotiation or in a way using the election results to win. The only difference between Iraq and Lebanon, and I'm not an expert on Lebanon by any stretch of imagination, is that Iraq has more of a restricted negotiation process time-wise. The constitution has a clock that ticks, and there is very little maneuver and wiggle room that they can do to drag the process. In the past, they interpreted the constitution loosely. For example, they allowed the first session to be open for months, and the Supreme Court said no, first session means first session, first day you elect everything. And then also, the only room really they can play with, which is basically convincing the High Elections Commission to take it's a little time to ratify the results. And that time, they are really, as you see, they started from now talking about negotiations and forming alliances, etc. That is the only time they can buy. The other thing is they can stretch the deadlines to the last minute, and that even will not give them more than 2 months and a half maximum if they decide to go for in one round. There might be an extra month if nothing happens, and then the president has to designate another one. So that's the only difference. But in essence, the Marja'iyya has come once again as a fair arbiter. It called it like it is, saying that there are flaws, 1, 2, 3, 4, yet here are, it split, if you will, the attention of people between two goods that they have to go for. One good is to elect a good government for the next 4 years. Another good is to participate and maintain democracy as a good in and of itself, because participation means you have to maintain this idea of notion of peaceful transfer of power, respect for elections, and carrying a democratization process. And may I remind everybody who all know here that Iraq is not a democracy. Iraq is a democratizing country, and the difference is a big notion here. Who knows if this and how long will it take for us to have a consolidated democracy? But you cannot have a consolidated democracy unless you run that democratization journey to its fullest extent.
Exactly, and we all wish, and we are rooting for Iraq in taking this process even further and better. Omar, so you started in your earlier comments talking about the implications of this vote on the da'wah within the Shiite community. How do you see this playing out within the Sunni community? I get a lot of these questions about, okay, where are we? I mean, there has been, where are the Sunni leaders now? Who are the Sunni leaders? And even until now, until recently, people were saying, well, the problem with the Sunni community, they don't have a centralized leadership like, right, the other communities. They don't have the duopoly. They don't have the da'wah. So where are the Sunnis? And did these elections produce a new core of leaders?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to go back and address your question about Sadr, which I have neglected, unfortunately. Yeah, I think Sadr started his evolution early on, probably from being the militia leader to trying to rebrand himself or reinvent his movement as a nationalist leader back in 2011, 2012, maybe even earlier than that, after the Charge of the Knights operation in 2008. And I think by 2016, it became evident that we cannot ignore Muqtada Sadr. When in 2016, he managed to mobilize 1 million people on the streets and to apply enormous pressure on the government to apply reforms and to get rid of corrupt politicians and corrupt ministers. And, it wasn't a very clean process. It involved breaking into the parliament and bruising some the ego and faces of some parliamentarians. But I think it became evident then that we cannot ignore him, that we have to talk to this guy. I think any country that wants to have a real influence in Iraq's internal politics or in Iraq's political process and how negotiations go, how, in the shape of the next government, needs to get, on the phone with Muqtada Sadr. And that involves not only Iran, but also the United States. I think this has been a gap in the U.S. diplomatic outreach in Iraq, and this has just gotten a lot more urgent, I think, with the results of these elections. Now, on to the other question on the Sunni Arabs, I think they are fragmented. I think the trend of fragmentation is well established now and has been probably deepened during this, the last term, 2014, 2018, and during these elections. We have seen, I think, some of the traditional Sunni political actors diminished in influence. I think I'm comparing the numbers between 2014 and today. The Wataniya coalition, which also, even though it's headed by a secular Shia, Iyad Allawi, it is seen primarily as an expression of Sunni political nationalist secular political expression. Has maintained its 21 seats or 22 seats, even though it has added the movement of what's his name, Saleh al-Mutlaq, which had on its own 10 seats in the previous election. So that's a reduction in influence. We see that the previous incarnation of Nujayfi coalition, the governor of the former governor Nino and his brother, the former Speaker of Parliament and current Vice President, they went from having 28 seats in the previous Parliament to somewhere between 13 and 19 now, and the numbers are still unconfirmed. So they have lost, I think, a good deal of influence and a good deal of representation. On the other hand, we see some new or returning political actors that are rising and will probably have an important role in this coming term, and that includes, I think, primarily the former Defense Minister Khalid al-Ubaidi, who has, I think, won one of the highest numbers of votes that an individual candidate has won this term. And by the way, that's, I think, another important trend, is that no individual candidate has won more than 100,000 or something, compared to 600 or 700,000, 721 by Maliki in the previous time. And I think, but again, these are not indications of where you end up, because Tariq al-Hashimi had about 300,000 votes, and where is he now? 2 years later, he was a wanted fugitive. So yeah, I think the previous centers of power are declining. We're going to see new faces or returning faces, especially in Ubaidi, but their actual weight and influence will depend on how the grander coalition shapes up. If Abadi joins, becomes an integral part of the next government, then Ubaidi will be an important figure. But if not, that could be a double sideline, so to speak.
Thank you. Bilal, the last question before I turn it over to the audience for their questions. Okay, you said that the Kurds have not yet gotten or started being part of the ongoing negotiation process in Baghdad, which I agree with you. I just was talking with people in Baghdad this morning, and they said they are talking about intense negotiations underway already. So, if you are going to be an advisor to the Kurdish group going for the negotiations, so what are the fights? What are the demands that you're going to be emphasizing going forward? What would the Kurds would like to have in return for their, especially KDP, PUK, in return for their 40-some seats going with one of the coalitions?
That's a very good and tough question. Well, first of all, I think there is generally with this election, we're going to have yet again a mismatch between what the public want and what the politics delivers. Meaning that this election, one of the reasons that was mentioned earlier why there was such a low turnout is because the Iraqi electorate was really disillusioned with this political class. They were, Shia, Sunni, Kurd, what the Iraqis had in common was low services, a lot of corruption going on in their governments. The politicians that they put in parliament were not responsive, and that resulted in a really, truly Iraqi sense of disillusionment with the political class. What that resulted in is a few things. One, factionalism within the sects, as I mentioned earlier, and then also some reinvention of personalities and parties. Like, some parties put on lipstick, others change their names from more religious sectarian sounding names to more I don't know, cuter names, but that didn't fly with the Iraqi electorate. Because they wanted a few things, as we saw in polls. They wanted better security, fighting corruption, for the youth in particular, job opportunities, and just better services. The thing about electricity, I mean, don't take it lightly. Iraq gets really, really hot. I mean, in 2016, one of the reasons why Southern managed to put 1 million people on the street, part of it was because people were hot. It was difficult to stay home. So heat in Iraq can actually result in a coup. Do not underestimate that. But what did the election give us? Did it give us a list with a clear mandate of fighting corruption? No. Has it given us a winner with a clear mandate and an agenda for improving the economy and creating jobs for the youth? No. It actually has given us a more divided polity. The Shia house is divided, the Kurdish house is divided, the Sunni house is divided, and therefore there's a mismatch between what the people want and what politics delivers. And to me, this only represents that 40% of the people that voted. So how about the 60% that did not vote? What are they going to do in August? You know, are they going to be on the streets again? You know, if this government doesn't deliver, what are they going to do next year? So I'm actually anticipating some instability. So in that context of lack of agenda, what do the Kurds ask for that kind of Iraqi polity? I don't think they're going to go there and ask for, more equitable budget revenue sharing, which it will be written, but that won't be a key ask. It would be wise for the Kurds to go and ask for the Iraqi national hydrocarbons law. Okay, they may put it on paper, but that would not be the main ask. I think Kirkuk will be neglected, implementing Article 140 of the Constitution that calls for, a referendum preceded by 2 other steps of normalization. So Kirkuk's future, whether it's part of Iraq, part of KRG, or independent region, I mean, that could win some votes, especially as Kurdish elections will take place in September. So you'll have some populism, nationalism going on. But the true Kurdish demands in Baghdad will be, what ministry am I going to get? Which of the positions am I going to get? Will it be the finance ministry, the foreign ministry, or the oil ministry? And then once you get those positions in Baghdad, then you come home and you say, okay, is it going to be this Bilal or that Bilal that's going to get that ministry? It's very unfortunate, and I think that's going to result in more resentment within the public, and then the vicious cycle continues. Sorry to be such a pessimist.
No, thank you.
It was the falafel that you served.
Thank you very much. So, now time for the question answer. Let me remind you, you ask the question, they answer. So, questions, no comments. So, I will start here, and then I'm going to move around. And we are going to take maybe let's do 3 questions at a time, and then, we'll do the answers, and then we do another round. Yes. And
Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins.
Please.
Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. Focus on the U.S. role. It's been said that it'll take $88 billion plus to rebuild Iraq. From your point of view, is that money going to come from the U.S., from China? And how much leverage does the United States have with Sadr, given the need to rebuild the country?
Okay. I mean, any of the president. Okay. Here, please. Yes. Dr. Dardari.
Yes, thank you. Bilal Saab, please, where did the Sunni votes...
Who are you?
I'm sorry, Abdullah Dardari from the World Bank. I have a question about the Sunni votes that departed from Hariri. Where did they go? I mean, I see the rise of pro-Syrian regime Sunni members of parliament. So it doesn't necessarily mean a disillusion with the alliance with Hezbollah and the Awnis, if this is the trend of the Sunni votes.
So the question is, where did that Sunni vote go? All right. And then the third question, sir. Yes, there, please. And then we are going to turn to the panel and then do another round and another round.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst, former U.S. diplomat. Along similar lines, the most interesting thing, Dr. Salem, is watching people vote outside their natural factional channel. So when Druze are voting for non-Druze, or non-Druze are voting for Jamaat's guys, do you have any way to sort of quantify that? Was it a historical high, more so than in the past? And what % of the population maybe votes outside of its natural factional lane?
All right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to have the two Lebanon panelists answer this first, and then I'm going to turn it to the question on Iraq. Please, short answers so that we can do many rounds of questions and answers. Paul, Bilal.
Abdullah, on the Sunni votes.
That was addressed to Bilal.
That's to Bilal,
Yes,
the Sunni
he
vote?
said Bilal.
Or go ahead.
I don't have a complete.
I'm Bilal, but I'm not going to get that question.
I don't have a complete picture, but I'll mention a few, and then maybe Paul knows the rest. Najib Miati, the Karamis of the world, and a few independents. But what was striking, if this is what you're really getting at, is that Ashraf Rifi didn't win. That was the dark horse that I was expecting to win in Tripoli, but he didn't. So that was very much noteworthy. Other individuals, frankly, within the same orbit of, pro-Syrian regime, but I don't really know specific names. If Paul knows them, then by all means.
Yeah, a quick comment. I mean, some of the Sunni votes didn't vote, and that's the low voter turnout, particularly in Beirut, where Hariri would have done very well. The election law also simply changed the results. It's not that he had more votes in some areas, but it used to be a majoritarian system, so if you have a plurality of votes, you get 100% of the seats. So, for example, in the north, the results weren't very different in terms of how people voted, but he didn't get the seats because the system is different. The main difference you'll see where you got candidates that are sort of more pro-Syrian is in the western Biqa, where there is a large Sunni vote. It's close to Syria. Traditionally, Syria has had a lot of influence there, as does Hezbollah. That's where some of those voices came out. So it's a mixed bag of results, and it's the boycott which weakened Hariri, particularly in Beirut. On the question of crossover votes between confessions, I would say with the new election law, one of the downsides of the new election law is that has been reduced in terms of how you can do that. It used to be that if you're in a district with 10 seats, you have 10 votes. You can choose 10 candidates. So you choose 3 Druze, but then there's 7 others. You'd also choose 7 others. Right now, in the current election system, you have to choose one pre-arranged list, one list, and within that list, you can only name one candidate whom you prefer to give your. So typically, you're going to prefer somebody usually within your own community. So unfortunately, that was reduced, and that's one of the downsides of the way it was done.
I think also, if I may add here, shift from moderator to participant. I think the no vote against Hariri, the no vote was a vote against Hariri, people who did not show up. And in the Sunni community, especially in Beirut, I think what happened to the Saudi OG, what happened to many of the Hariri-controlled companies have affected so many Sunni Beirutis in their livelihood. So you have tales, you hear in Beirut tales after tales of Sunni Beirutis who, depended on these jobs. And you are talking about thousands of voters who can tell stories, personal stories of economic loss, of people who lost their job in Saudi OG, people who lost their job in Future TV, people who lost their job in, the newspaper, in the Bank Med. And it's all around, because that was part of the Hariri patronage system. So his financial difficulties translated, in my opinion, in people not voting against him, because there is still loyalty to the father, because this is the father who sent their kids, to school, to universities. There is that loyalty. But it translated in a no vote, in a not showing up against, on the day of vote, because they did not want to vote against him, but they refused to vote for him given what they are suffering. This is an underreported element, but in Sunni Beirut, when you meet with people who are traditional Hariri constituency, this is a very strong kernel of discontent there. So, who would like to, we have a panel of 3 Iraqi analysts. All of you are excellent. So one of you will have to take a crack at this question, and then we can ask if there is something to add. Please.
I will start with answering my esteemed colleague from SAIS, or Johns Hopkins, I should say. Yes, not just SAIS. This is a question with many moving targets, and I think it will take all 3 of us to answer it. I will just focus on a few issues. One of them is the money issue. This administration is not much into the giving mood. If ever they give, they will probably convince someone else to cough up the money rather than, so regional, etc. But the money will be a huge issue. Iraq is a rentier state with only oil revenue that is entering in its coffers. So one of the moving targets is the price, of course, of oil. Also, the other obligations for the new government to run the budget only on oil. That's why I think, and that I would leave it to Bilal to emphasize, is basically the next government will have to have a better economic agenda rather than the previous administrations. Iraq cannot go along with this kind of bad economic planning or lack thereof. The Sadr issue, of course, we don't know if Sadr is going to be the one who calls the shots. This depends on who will be the prime minister, whether he's Sadr candidate or someone else. But instantly, Sadr is kind of the in-between on the spectrum from a U.S. calculation. The U.S. number one choice probably will be Abadi. But the other choice that is realistic also will be Amiri. So that would be a complete loss. So Sadr is in between because he's not very close to Iran. He's also not very close to the U.S., but he is, in a way, he's in the middle. So I think that he is not going to stand in the way of any good planning to rebuild the country. But this challenge will hinge more on really where you come up with the resources. It's an enormous amount of money. And also you need to make sure, and what we saw in the Kuwait conference, most of the people who were willing to give the money were either reluctant or decided not to give as much as they would because of the corruption and the lack of transparency. And that has to be also tackled ahead of time before you go to Japan and other countries, the EU, and then say, give us this amount of money to rebuild Iraq, to make sure the dollars go to rebuilding rather than to private accounts.
I agree with what Dr. Abbas said. I'd only add probably two other points and tie it back to the preface to your question about the U.S. leverage. U.S. leverage is actually the ability to convene the things like the Kuwait conference. None of the other Iraqi counterparts, okay, let me be clear, Iran cannot do that. So that's where the U.S. leverage in Iraq is going to be. The other point of leverage for the United States government is security. I think 2014 was a clear message, and actually not just a message to the ruling elite, but to every Iraqi that that country still needs the United States. 2014 was, when ISIS came and within weeks took a third of the country. People realized that asking the United States government to leave was a mistake. So even I've read the platforms of these political parties, none of them officially asked for the U.S. troops to leave Iraq. And there is more of a conciliatory term. Now, of course, some slogans came up in the election campaign, but they all have a realization that the U.S. should stay for Iraq to stabilize. So those are the 2 points of leverage. On the economy and reconstruction, in addition to Kuwait conference, and of course I completely agree with the question of reform, which is tied to the Kuwait conference, the United States is not giving money, and therefore is not leading by example, and therefore other countries are not donating to Iraq. But countries and companies are interested in investing in Iraq if Iraq makes itself welcoming of foreign direct investment. And that requires legal reforms, fighting corruption, cutting off the whole patronage dynamic that works in Iraq. And that's also an area that, for example, the IMF is helping with, and Iraq has been very well receptive. The other two things that go well for the KRG, for Iraq, is rising oil production in Iraq and rising oil prices. So it's kind of a double whammy for Iraq. But this may blunt some of the reform efforts. Because reforming a petro-state or a rentier economy, they don't do it because it's a good idea. They do it because they have to. Boots have to be there, and the boot that has worked in Iraq was the emergence of ISIS and low oil prices. So again, it's kind of a double-edged sword with the oil. And then finally, there is an opportunity for rebuilding Mosul in particular, to bring the KRG and Baghdad closer together on cooperating on rebuilding Mosul. Many of the cement factories that are closest to Mosul are in the KRG. And that would create job opportunities for not only the youth in Mosul, but also for many of the businesses that may actually find Erbil as their headquarters, and that's something that Baghdad should welcome.
I'm going to do a second round of question, and then I will Omar, I'll give you the opportunity to answer, to address, or do you would like to add something?
No, let's go
Yeah,
ahead.
let's do that.
Sure.
Yes. Okay, sir, please. Then I'll come to you. Please. So 3 questions, and then we'll turn it on. Yes, please.
This is a question for Mr. Wahab. So in previous conversations, you've mentioned something about the centralization of the major Kurdish parties within families within Kurdistan. So do you think that these recent results and the challenges to those in terms of the recount indicate a willingness to challenge that sort of status, and will that then end up being unaffected by this challenge if it does happen to be one?
Thank you. Next question, sir, please. Is there a micro here, please? Yes.
Alexander Kravitz from Insight. Hello, great panel. A couple of questions. One, just on the outreach to Sadr, I'm wondering if you know of any foreign calls that he may have gotten from foreign governments. Then on the Kurdistan, I have two questions. One is, could somebody walk us through how would the complaints to IHEC be dealt with, and wouldn't that be part of creating sort of maintaining the integrity of the process? And I was surprised that you did not mention the economic situation in the KRG as part of the negotiations. I mean, they have, I don't know, maybe depending on who you ask, 2022, a couple billion, several $1 billion in debt. I mean, how would that not be part of the conversation? Thank you.
Third question, sir, please.
Hi, Abad Alawi with the US-UA Business Council. Thank you for your comments. My question is very overview. I just want to know what your opinion is of what the next steps for the GCC will be with both Lebanon and Iraq, and what are your personal predictions?
Thank you. Okay, Omar, why don't you start with this question,
Sure.
please,
Yeah,
and the Sadr question as well. Please.
Yeah. Sorry, the question on the GCC?
Yes.
Okay. I think we saw some good, developments in relationships between Iraq and the GCC in the last year or so. Visits by the Saudi foreign minister, meetings between Prime Minister Abadi and the Crown Prince, and I believe the King as well. They may have met. So there's definitely an opening. I think we saw perhaps one of the most important diplomatic events in Iraq was the soccer match between the Iraqi and Saudi soccer teams in Basra, nonetheless, a little while ago. I think the participation in the Kuwait conference from the GCC and their pledges to invest in Iraq and to send their companies, some of the heavy hitters in their industries like SABIC and others, I think these are all good indicators. And I think that also a good segue to the Sadr question, because I think if the U.S. or other countries that are interested in opening channels to Muqtada al-Sadr, there are a lot of mediators that could assist with that probably, including Saudi Arabia and UAE, which had received Sadr on important high-profile visits, including meetings with the Saudi Crown Prince. If you read Sadr's statements or those of his main aides, they will say that they're willing to talk to anyone who is not of a representative of a state of occupation, and by that he means U.S., UK, or any other members of the previous coalition. However, there are lots of nuances to these statements, and when you look at some of the more recent commenting on their position towards continued U.S. engagement in Iraq, towards arms deals. Iraq's Air Force depends heavily on U.S. involvement with the F-16 program. There is, obviously an important training mission both by the U.S. and by NATO. And I think the Sadr's position was, a little bit showing a lot of flexibility, saying that it's fine so long as there's no interference in sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So I think, that's an open door. Yeah. That's an open door there.
Any
Oh,
collateral?
not that I heard of.
Only
Yeah.
person was the former Saudi ambassador to Iraq,
Famir Sabhan.
Oh, yeah.
Famir Sabhan, who echoed Sadr's riddle and made his own riddle, mostly really sticking it in the face of Maliki rather than congratulating Sadr. But it was interesting, actually.
So let's stay with this issue of Gulf relations. Bilal, would you like to comment on Bilal,
the other
and then
Bilal,
we'll
sorry.
turn to Iraq. Yeah, Bilal, would you like to comment on this Gulf Lebanon, post-elections relations, especially Saudi-Lebanese, please?
Okay, very briefly, I know that Paul has some things to say too. You remember the episode of the resignation of the Prime Minister Saad Hariri? What was remarkable about it is that it showed, maybe not surprisingly, but it showed that the man had support that was much larger than we all expected from capitals like Paris and Washington. Now, does that mean that moving forward, can he actually survive without the Saudis? I don't think so. But there's a specific reason why he is so eager to enter into the government and remain prime minister, is because should relations not be repaired with the Saudis after what happened, he can rely on his position in the government as prime minister and whatever comes with that financially to continue to survive. I think a wound was created between the two sides when he was forced to resign in Riyadh. Now that the elections are over, it's a question of how those relations are going to be repaired, because my guess is that Saudi policy has adjusted after what happened, because that measure clearly backfired. And so we'll see to what extent the Saudis still rely on him to preserve their interests, or they might try to find other ways to do that. But for now, I think he still is the candidate.
Maybe a broad comment that, it's very important to look how Saudi foreign policy, after change of leadership in Saudi Arabia and the death of the long-serving foreign minister, went into a period of kind of being, maybe call it erratic a little bit, but the positive signs, at least towards Iraq and Syria, obviously the Saudi opening to Iraq is very significant for Iraq, but I think it's also significant as an indicator of a pragmatic approach by Saudi Arabia, particularly to countries of the Levant. And the step that they took last November, but then they had the pragmatism to step back and change policy, and that was a good sign. And currently their policy, although they're not maybe thrilled with Saad Hariri himself, but they are committed to support of the Lebanese state. They've joined in many of the conferences, and they recognize that engaging with Lebanon, even though there's a lot of Iranian and Hezbollah influence, is a pragmatic step for them. And I think the missing link in all of that, obviously, is the situation in Syria, in that whereas the Saudis in the Gulf are open to a pragmatic solution in Syria, the other side isn't. The Assad regime and its allies are not even open to a pragmatic solution. So I think it may be good news, the other things for Iraq and Lebanon. The real Chernobyl in the region is Syria and remains that as well. I think it's on a more local level, going back to something Bilal said, it is significant that Ashraf Rifi did not win. And maybe from the Saudi point of view, there was no hero of the anti-Hezbollah movement that beat Saad al-Hariri or that even won. The others are either billionaires or pro-Assad people. So that leaves, again, Saudi Arabia with very few options other than reluctantly being okay with Hariri, I think, for now. And Hariri is making moves to clean up his operation to be closer to Saudi.
That's right.
Bilal.
Yeah, sure. Quick answers to the questions pertaining to the KRG. Jackson, yes. The main criticism of the Kurdish opposition is that it's a family duopoly that's ruling the KRG, that has been ruling the KRG. And they've been treating the opposition as landlords. They've been willing to give them rooms, let them stay, maybe free of rent, but now never own and have equity in the real estate. And of course, the opposition parties have been trying to change this, and they have not been successful. And I think this is, and again, not successful meaning that there were inroads and then two step forward, maybe one back, sometimes the other way around. But this also actually, to quote a conversation that we recently had, KRG is the canary in the coal mine for everything else that's going to happen in Iraq. If you let political parties with very strong militias, and the militias, the government, if these political, let me put it this way, what we had in the KRG is two political parties with militias that created a government. It was their government, and yet they did not let their own militias to be accountable and be part of their own government. They did not trust, their own government with their militias. And this is what we have today. For example, we've had political parties, one of these two parties that have lost elections, and that didn't change anything. They would go with fraud, and that wouldn't change anything. And sometimes it has become, the other day, one of the Kurdish leaders actually said that, 1 seat, 100 seats is not going to change a thing. So in a way, it's become a fact of life. And that's one of the dangers of having, militias that are not accountable, that's not integrated in state society, because, again, if Kurdistan is any indication, that would be one of the dangers. About the economy, on a related note, that duopoly is under a lot of pressure, and one of the pressures is economic failure. They promised their citizenry that give us a chance, we will produce 1 million barrels of oil a day, we'll give you not only, before an independent economy that's going to be better than the 17% that the KRG used to get from Iraq. That did not materialize for a variety of reasons. But in the meantime, the KRG has accrued a lot of debt, you're right. But the Iraqi government also accrued a lot of debt. The difference between KRG and Baghdad is that as a sovereign, the Iraqi government is able to, it has more leeway and has more facilities for debt management, unlike the KRG. But that definitely, the question of debt will be added to the question of budget, rights over oil and gas exports, and revenue sharing from the oil and gas exports in the upcoming Iraqi-Baghdad negotiations. Which, if that's going to be the center of the negotiations, now the balance of power has tipped in a direction that we might actually have an opportunity with new faces and new actors in the government to finally move forward on these questions.
So how is this complaint going to be prosecuted going forward?
Well, there are several aspects to it. Iraq elections are run by independently by the Elections Commission or the High Elections Commission. And those who have grievances about the results will have to go to the Elections Commission itself to tell them about problems with the way they run the elections. So that's a little bit of a little trick here. But on the other hand, the way it works first, mostly if there are some closed votes, they will have to go to the commission probably to ask for, this time going by verification or hand counting or any other way. If the commission sees that it merits the doing what is wanted, they will do it. If not, they will just reject it. Also, there are problems that are documented in terms of violations in the elections, and that's an issue that they have to deal with, and they will take these documents, evaluate them, and look at them. There are, of course, we already know that several parties and coalitions did make complaints, especially several Kurdish groups, Dr. Barham Saleh and others, have called into question what was done in some places. There are also, and Dr. Iyad Allawi also called for some drastic measures. He called for canceling the elections, which is really not something he should do. But also, I think most importantly will be going back to how they apply the law itself. Until now, we don't know. There are some courses, because they have to deal with what choices are, how you are going to choose between a candidate who won votes or having to give the seat to a quota candidate, and that's an issue. So that's why some groups might not merit a seat, but they end up getting a quota seat, especially for the women quota. That happens. This is one case in Najaf, for example, where Al-Hikma is fighting for one with Dawlat al-Qanun, with state of law. And that's how they do it. However, if still there are grievances that are not satisfactory after the decision made by the High Commission, then the next resort will be the court. And Supreme Court, and then at that point, then there will be the certification, final certification of the results. And in fact, this is, I mean, it has happened in the past, but not really with drastic changes. I think this time around is not going to be as bad as it used to be, for example, when Maliki versus Allawi happened to run, and that was a big fight. This time it's only innocuous irregularities that are expected anyway.
Anybody would like to add to this last point on the prosecution of the... No?
I think Abbas did a great job.
So,
Thank you.
sir, please, last round of questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for a thoughtful discussion. It's Russian Embassy, Artur Lukmanov. I have a question to the Iraqi panelists coming from Iraq. With the picture in the regional context in Lebanon quite clear as pro-Western backed forces losing the vote, how do you see these results of the elections in Iraq in the regional and international context? How do you see the credibility vote to the forces in Iraq backed by foreign powers engaged in the Iraqi elections? And on the day of the elections, we had State Department's congratulations to the Iraqi people on the elections, but also we had there the wish of the State Department to save the strategic framework agreement. It's a yes or no question. Do you think it's normal to have it on the date of the elections, to have this foreign wish for the elections? And if you had some deliberations, that would be welcome. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Thank you. My name is Nizar Farsakh. I'm a leadership and advocacy trainer. My question is to both Bilals on Kurdistan and Lebanon. In a training, I did a training with Iraqi activists, Kurdish and from other parts of Iraq, and this frustration with the political elite, with the political map, is very strong. It's just they don't see how it could change. So my question to both of you is, in Lebanon and in Iraq or Kurdistan, what needs to happen? What kind of event or what contextual change needs to happen for either a new political party that has changes the political map, or like a political movement like the Cedar Revolution or some other movement that pulls the political parties to be closer to what the demands of the citizens or the voters are?
Okay, thank you. One last question. Gentleman there, please.
Thank you. John Anderson. This is with regard to the Iraqi population's interest in issues of the Syrian conflict, and not so much how these played out in the election in terms of positions of parties and individuals there, but more generally perhaps. And I'm talking about issues like, obviously, the final liberation of Syria from the pockets still controlled by Daesh. I'm talking about a new a new Turkish occupation of parts of north of Syria, U.S. and Allied control of large parts of eastern Syria, and a new factor entering into perhaps the Iraqi consciousness, you tell me, parts of the Hashid Shabi, the popular mobilization forces, issued new calls. I'm thinking particularly of statements by leaders of Asa'ab Ahl al-Haq on the one hand, Kitab Hezbollah on the other, calling for the liberation of occupied Golan, that is actively promising to come and take part in Syria in the liberation of Golan. What is the general feeling? What issues there play to the Iraqi population? Is there strong interest? Is there no interest? Can you comment on that?
Thank you. I mean, it's important to note on the issue of Syria and Iraq, As-Sadr was the first prominent Shia cleric to call for the Iraqi militias to get out of the country and to return to, not to be involved in the fight against the Syrian people, which is important to remember. Okay, we have this question. Who would like to tackle the first question from our colleague here from the Russian embassy? Yeah.
Okay, was your question about the pro-Western forces in Iraq losing the election? I wouldn't characterize it as such.
No, he's saying how do you classify this elections? In Lebanon there is this narrative of pro-West, losing. Yeah. Is that the same in Iraq?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as such. I think if we go back to the earlier parts of the discussion, the real results are 3 or 4 months down the road. That's when the negotiations are concluded, and the shape of the actual governing coalition is going to take, is going to form up. Right now, these are just numbers. These are just a stepping stone into the discussions, into the real negotiations. Again, I think the picture is more nuanced. I don't think Iraqis view it as pro-Western and anti-Western, because I think Iraq looks at its surroundings in different terms. Iran is a more, I think, in Iraq's immediate neighborhood, I think, is more important than positions towards the West. The West is an important actor, but it's also a distant actor. So I think the pro and anti-Iran, or the pro-Iran versus the more centrist nationalist, these are the distinctions or the fault lines that Iraqis look at. But of course, maintaining good relations with Western governments, that has been a delicate matter, I think, in the mind, in this mentality of Iraqi voters. There is, I think, an acknowledgement that Iraq cannot maintain its even its structural integrity as a state, even territorial integrity, without much aid from outside, given the really turbulent times that it has gone through, the turbulent dynamics that it has gone through, the forces that has been acting on it. But at the same time, there is a desire for having your own decision-making, your own sovereignty. Again, I don't think the Iraqis would see this as the election results as targeted towards or against the West, but more of an expression of Iraq's popular will after emerging from the war with ISIS. That's I think the more important expression here.
Would you like to address the question here of the gentleman in terms of the public mood, vis-a-vis?
Oh, Syria. I think you made a good point. The most I think Iraqis want out of Syria is to keep Syria away. It's a conflict that didn't really bring much to Iraq other than death, and the proximity of the Syrian civil war allowed ISIS to make its move and incursion into Iraq in mass in 2014. Without that, I think it wouldn't have had that effect. And without the Syrian civil war, I think the regional state of polarization that really created this toxic environment that allowed this second civil war in Iraq to take place, I think that was also in large part a result of the dynamics in Syria. I think whatever involvement that some of the Iraqi armed groups are having now in Syria will become less and less popular. They're not popular now. I think they will be even more unpopular in the future. They will become a liability, I think, going forward. I think in 2020, as Iraq's political and democratic process matures, we're going to see probably these issues becoming, they will probably detract from the appeal of the parties that seek to have let's say, to pull Iraq into the fault lines of this regional polarization and away from the actual problems of the country itself.
Thank you. Would you like to answer?
Yeah, I agree with Omar, and I think we need to pay attention to the nuances Omar was talking about. No group that won seats is a monolith that is in the camp of this side or the other side. Sadr's group, I mean, it's how can you call the Sadr win as a win of a coalition that is close to Iran or against Iran? There are Shia, there are Sunnis who are with an Arab nationalist sort of mood. There are the communists, and this is a group. Even the PMUs, the Fatah coalition, There are many of the PMUs who declare on their websites and in their media appearances that they do not want to even to talk to the Iranians, and they never talked to the Iranians. And there are those who are very close to the Iranians, and they say it, so you don't have to even look for that. As it comes to the Prime Minister's coalition, it's not all pro-West or pro-Iran. This is, they have a variety of coalitions. Each one of these coalitions has several parties, and each party has its own. It's really a convenience of elections and calculations of how they will do in the elections that put them together in one coalition, but they are not like as a monolith, like, a Western concept of a party. It's a coalition. The other part that is important on Syria, sir, it's the Iraqis have made it clear. The government clearly said that the only PMUs or PMFs, popular mobilization, that we acknowledge as Iraqi popular mobilization are those who fight in Iraq against ISIS. Those who are out, in fact, the Prime Minister said, if you blame us for them, you should blame also France and Belgium and the United States for those that went and fought for ISIS, because they are citizens of these countries.
Yeah.
Just the fact that our citizens crossed the border without their weapons and got there, or with even, that's an issue that should not be blamed on the Iraqi government. Also, the PMU law that the parliament put together, and Abadi was supposed to put it, and I think now we will see who will implement it, and that's a big question I made in many occasions. Basically, it acknowledges only the PMUs that fought in Iraq and that report to the PMU organization that reports to the Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief. So Syria, as much as there are Iraqis who feel just like others who went into Syria, Iraq, the government and the people are pretty much in maybe one camp when it comes to looking or viewing at it as not something that Iraq wants to be part of the Syrian conflict. And as Omar ably mentioned, that the best thing they want to do is to put a firewall that the terrorists don't come again, who are a menace to Syria, the Syrian people, and to the Iraqi people, as ISIS did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bilal. So the question about
Sure.
change, please, quickly. We have 5 minutes.
That is a very tough question.
And big question.
It's a big question, too. I would basically say the Iraqi people, the Kurdish people, they're really vibrant, they're well-educated, they know what they want, they try. Their votes get stolen, changed, but they do make their voices heard. The civil society is active, the media landscape is active, and we, in the KRG in particular, not just in Iraq, but in KRG in particular, we have a new generation of Kurdish leaders that don't have the mountain cred, so they can't say that they fought Saddam Hussein or they liberated Kurdistan. So what do instead? They have to basically show the roads that they build and the schools and the hospitals and the services. Otherwise, they will lose legitimacy, and the public is more demanding. They feel more entitled. If the votes don't count, they go on the streets, and the government can try once, twice, 3 times, 10 times, but eventually that relationship has to be working for both sides. Both sides have to make some compromises, and compromise on the government side is reform. And within the Kurdish leadership, there are some very reform-minded people. The problem is that they're competing with dinosaurs. They're competing with, like every other government, I guess, competing with people who want to promote the status quo. Again, the two sources of legitimacy in Iraq and in Kurdistan is, as this election shows, are you going to vote for people who protected you from a danger, be it ISIS, be it Saddam Hussein's regime, or are you going to vote for people who are going to, who promise you a better future, a better economy? With the question about democracy, I think the Iraqis showed very clearly that they're loud and clear, that they're committed to democracy. The question of interference in sovereignty, I think the United States is more concerned about Iraqi sovereignty than Iraqis are. The question of interference is, it's not like Iraq does not like foreign interference. I think Iraq is more interested in balance of foreign interference. We want more people rather than just one party, and that also reflects in the relationship of the political parties. The reason why, for example, someone like Abadi is popular is because he is friends with Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia and Turkey without being enemies of Iran. The problem with the other parties is if they choose Iran, then they have to become enemies of Saudi Arabia. If they choose Saudi Arabia or they choose Kuwait, they have to be enemy of the other side. The tact, the political tact in Iraq is to be friends with your neighbors. You can be enemies of your neighbors because they're bigger, stronger, sometimes more deadlier than you. So how do you become more friends with them? And then the more friends you have in your country, therefore the more independent you are. So it's not just kicking everyone out, it's having everyone in a way. It may not be ideal, but I think that's the reality on the ground.
Thank you. Bilal, Lebanon, quickly answering that.
Cataclysmic event that would really change the rules of the game or the relationship between ruler and ruled. You'd think 15 years of civil war would have actually been that event, but those, that episode really didn't change anything about that relationship. Relating it to the elections more specifically,
especially
there were
civil society, did not do well.
Precisely. So that's what I was going to get into. So two attempts, as minor as they are, to try to really campaign on a promise of reform and also perhaps even join an opposition movement were civil society, exactly what Randa was saying, and that's my assessment, perhaps people will disagree, the Kata'ib party. Kata'ib won 3, so they lost 2 from the 5 that they had before. They probably even would have won even fewer if not Sami was the son of Amin and Nadim was the son of the assassinated Bashir. Civil society fielded, I don't know how many candidates, but they ended up with 1. Therefore, it just tells you that as much as there is a desire to really try to change things the way you described them, so far those attempts have been quite unsuccessful.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the wonderful panel. That was very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.